People, as Trine said, even the recipients are skeptical to have what they call handouts.
Yeah, I think partly it's because the way that social protection has been articulated in many low middle income countries. It's been articulated as benefits for the poor, not as support for citizens. Okay? And so when it's seen for the poor, then it's really for a tiny proportion of the population, and the majority are going to oppose that because they're going to oppose their taxes. It's exactly what you were saying. What I was saying, there's good evidence for that, and I think Tanzania is a classic example, you know, of programs being developed for the poor. The majority excluded. They're put out as almost as it's a donor project, and so why are people going to get behind that? In contrast, the universal pension in Zanzibar is very much a program for all citizens. So all citizens of Zanzibar will access that program when they're age 70. It's a public service. It's part of a welfare system. It's not a cash transfer as such. It provides transfers in the form of cash, but it's seen as a public service, you know, that everybody gets, and therefore it's much more popular. And it's once governments, particularly in a democratic context, begin to make that transition and see these as rights of citizens, and also see them in a democratic context, that you can get political gains from it, then you see a big transformation. That's why in Kenya, which has followed a sort of similar model for Tanzania for a while, is now shifting to more universal provision because it's a more democratic context now in Kenya, and they realize they can win an election, and therefore they put a universal pension in the electoral platform, won the election, are delivering it, and that will lead to a big transformation in that country. And these are things that many other countries, developing countries, have learned. But still, when we articulate it as handouts for the poor, which is exactly how it's interpreted and often understood, it's never going to get support.
Colin, handouts, is that the negative phrase? That's
yeah, so I think we have to go away from these things, and sort of move more in the direction of sort of that these are certain rights that people have. These are collectively owned income, just as sort of the productivity of the land is God-given in most countries, and it shouldn't be just those who grab the land should have all the land rents. Just like oil revenues in this country, I think it should be shared with the whole world, but since we don't get majority for that, at least it should be shared with all the citizens in this country, and the oil in Tanzania likewise. But I think there's one important thing here that seems to be sometimes forgotten. And if you think just to take from the rich and give to the poor, and think about that as a good, that is, you have less interest in that good the richer you are. So that means that it's an inferior good. If you become richer, you would like to have less of it. If you take social insurance and control, for the health risk that you have or the unemployment risk, that means keeping your social position in society constant, but moving your income. That is a normal good. Because the richer you are, the better insured you would like your home to be, the better insured you want your kids to be, the better facilities you would have. These are normal goods in that sense that the richer you are, the more you will have of it. And that means that to pack welfare provision as a normal good that increases the support as you move on. By packing the development benefits as taken from the rich and give to the poor, once you cross a certain threshold, you are among those who are taxed and not given to. So that's it's a very different logic politically, and I think sort of socially in the support of these programs. And we have tested these things across. We have tested it for US and Norway, and sort of, for example, see that by studying panels of reporters in surveys, what kind of welfare provisions they would like. And we see exactly this pattern, that there's a normal good for insurance aspects, and it's an inferior good for these purely redistributive schemes.
Well, the Norwegian barnetrygden, the child support.
That is universalistic spending for everybody, and it's meant...
And it's totally accepted.
Well, I wouldn't say totally. No, and then even the socialists come with arguments that we should cut it from the rich, and so undermine it. It's very important to say that you should keep this motivated as a compensation for the cost of having children. And of course, in the contribution to the scheme, the rich pay more than the poor, so it's redistributive in that sense. And I think sort of universal basic income that I'm in favor of it in one way or another, that's child support for grown-ups. So.
But Trine, your work in Tanzania shows people are skeptical and they want more social services from the state. So they are moving in the direction that Stephen is talking about into. Is that correct?
Yes, I think Tanzania is a great example because it shows nuances and it's paradoxical in some ways what we find. So when you ask, if you poll people and you ask just simply, would you like the benefits from oil and gas to flow to household as a transfer without anything else, then most people will say yes, we would like that.
Of course you want money in your pocket.
There's no, and they become actually more positive the more targeting you put to it. Like, would you be positive to it being targeted to orphans and widows? And you see the response. They're actually more and more positive to those kinds of transfers. If you ask the question, should the money be spent on transfers directly to people, households, you guys, or should it be spent on schools, clinics, public spending in social sectors, large amounts of people will go for the options, or will prefer the option of spending on public services. And that's where you go back to the situation in Tanzania. Schools and clinics are really poor developed. There's a huge need for investments in infrastructure and investments in the quality, of course, of these services. And so there is a trade-off when you come to these discussions of handouts, which is, I don't want to start to use that phrase, but it's what you hear in the public. So yes, there is a trade-off fiscally, and I think we have to keep that in mind. Yeah.
Let me throw in gender into this. Should cash transfers be targeted to women or men? Stephen, you have any?
Well, I think it depends on the context. I mean, old age pensions, for example, are a critical benefit for women. Most older people in low middle income countries, the much higher proportion of older people are women rather than men. So by generally putting in place an old age pension, you're benefiting.
That's natural causes.
That's natural causes. You know, but it's a kind of, you know, it's an equal distribution done on a rationale that everybody's a citizen on an equal basis. So there's a gender equality in it, but naturally benefits both men and women, but women more. Again, on children, why would you differentiate between a young boy and a young girl necessarily? I think by putting in place those benefits equally, girls are going to benefit on an equal basis. So we're getting gender equality from that. I think we have to look at some of the design of some of the programs. You know, many of the public works programs in Africa, I don't know the exact design in Tanzania, but I know design in other countries like Rwanda are very gender insensitive, in that these are household benefits that go to the head of the household, who's often male, but they send often young women out to work. They do the work, and the male in the household gets the cash. And that's a very gender unequal benefit. I find it bizarre that we support those kind of programs that if you work, you don't get paid. It goes to the often the male head who's sitting at home and not doing anything. And somehow we've allowed ourselves in international development programs like Ethiopia and Rwanda, Uganda, to get into that kind of situation, which are very insensitive of women. But other programs you have in, you know, where in Nepal they do have program which is for all widows, but not widowers, are getting the benefit, but because they have no support, you could argue then why don't widowers get the support there? So I would argue more for a basis of gender equality in provision rather than necessarily benefiting one or the other, and ensuring that our design is not prejudicing women, which is often what happens. Often the conditional cash transfers often are very criticised, such as the other part, say the Tanzania one, in that often they give the cash to the woman, but they expect the woman to do all the work in the sanctions, or do all to fulfil the conditions, and if not, they're the ones who are sanctioned by the removal of the benefit. And there's a lot of gender insensitivity in those by putting all the burden on women.
Yeah. Cool.
I think I agree to most of the things, but there are many examples where there are more benefits to be held by giving it to women rather than men. If you have to choose one of them, there seems to be care more about children than males in most cases. I think, for example, that we pay child allowances to women have been benefited Norwegian kids more than they would have done otherwise. You can also see it in the sort of savings behavior and self-protection group, self-help group in the slums in African countries. So we studied Kibera, for example, where we found that self-help groups is much more better organized and work better when married women with some income on their own were part of it. These are rotating savings and credit association, where poor people have sort of saving schemes for, say, for school uniforms or a new roof on the hut where they live, things like that. And so the imitation of a credit market, but was a small saving bank or whatever you can say. And there's much more women who participate in it. And typically these women that need both the protection against males and they have priorities for the saving behavior of the household. So I think there are some benefits there, but I'm very in agreement with Stephen that there can't be one rule that's sort of independent of the context. These things have to be sort of studied locally at the local level, and local tradition and history really matters.
Yeah, but I think you're in a child benefit, it should go to the female carer. Unless there is no female carer, then it should go to the male carer. There's often good benefits around that. When you add the conditions on, it becomes problematic.
But Trine, you said that when the compliance kicks in these schemes, then it must be the woman who must get the sanctions. That's also, as Simon said, another pressure on her.
I think it's a very good point that you carry the burden of complying, but you also get the blame, if you want, when penalties kick in, and that could create some tensions that you don't want to see at the household level, of course. But it's more the burden that you place on women, on being the bearer of these co-responsibilities, I think. But I think just to add on the Tanzanian side, what is really important, it doesn't have to do with targeting the benefits to women specifically, but that you can use these cash transfer programs to address issues like reproductive health, sexual information to youth, and they're doing that to adolescents abroad, but that you really reach that age group, and that you are targeting, for instance, the current increase in teenage pregnancy by not only getting them into schools but also getting information out. But it doesn't necessarily be targeting girls only or women only.
Stephen, when it comes to building social safety nets, what role should aid play in that?
Well, I think actually development assistance is one of the bigger problems in this whole area at the moment. As I was saying, most of the inclusive or universal programs are being driven by governments themselves without any support from development partners, because they're operating in a different context of accountability to citizens. And the problem that's been is that the development partners come in and generally, as I was saying, tend to promote poverty-targeted programs from which governments will gain no electoral or political benefits for the poor. So one role for development partner is to move away from actually enforcing what we think is the best solution, to actually getting behind what governments can play. Now, I think there's questions around funding, right? A lot of the programs are being funded by development partners. I'd question whether that's appropriate and whether the system should be really about helping these countries build systems, and ensure the more effective delivery of these programs, rather than necessarily funding these programs, because actually all countries have sufficient funds. They just need to have designs of programs that are popular. I think development partners can help build awareness about different paradigms. I think what I do find strange, looking at the Nordic countries, is how you have great models of social protection, but you aren't confident enough to go out there and say, why don't you follow our models, right? Which is actually what most developing countries are trying to get behind, is to move eventually to a Nordic style.
On the other hand, we say we won't force you into the Norwegian model.
No, but you're not going to force people, but you are forcing people into the 19th century Norwegian model. Okay? There are two Norwegian models. There's the 19th century Norwegian model and there's the 21st century Norwegian model. The TASAF is very much, or the productive safety net is very much 19th century classic. Poor relief with conditions, workfare, etc. That's the 19th century Norway model. You rejected it. We rejected it. Everybody rejects it. Why are we pushing that? Why don't we say help them move to more modern systems that are more effective, more popular, ones that will be financially sustainable? Because the interesting thing is the more expensive programs, which are more universal, are much more financially sustainable because they have support of that. And I think what you were saying in Tanzania shows exactly the case. Zanzibar's universal pension is fiscally sustainable. TASAF, it's not, because government's never going to put the money into those kind of programs. We know that across Africa. So I think development partners have to have a clear role. Stop pushing, stop trying to get our funding to do it. The loans that are coming, funding these programs from loans, I think is highly problematic. But getting behind building systems and building awareness that there are many different approaches, I think is a very effective role. And I think Nordics, could have a great role to play in that, because of the transition that you have from the 19th century to now, and explain that to countries and let them take their option.
A comment from Trine, and then we can have a few questions from the audience.
I just applaud what you said. It's a danger that some people work in development in foreign assistance or whatever, that they are so afraid to say what their own experiences are, because they're going to decide by themselves that they implicitly are really supporting a very bad scheme that they don't want to have. So I agree to that.
I feel I do have to defend a little bit the donor community in Dar es Salaam now. Because yes, I agree that there is the sustainability issues, but there also is very little political will right now to push hard for alternative options. But there is a lot of work alongside this TASAF program in supporting the setup of a national social protection system and a national social protection policy. A lot of efforts is being put into that dialogue with government around this, and it's a very difficult process, but definitely there is a lot of emphasis on it. And I totally agree the Tanzania example illustrates the problems with the poor aid type programs.
If I could just say, because I know a little bit about the history of the program in Tanzania, there was a strong push around 2010-11 from DFID, or the United Kingdom, to support and finance a universal pension across Tanzania. And they wanted to do that, but then the World Bank came in and spoke with the Ministry of Finance, got them to reject the DFID grant, which would have been an amazingly large grant, or the UK grant, and take on the loan from the World Bank. And so the Tanzanians were in the part of a battle between donors. Surely this should be a debate between the government and citizens, not a battle between DFID and the World Bank, which is what it ends up being. And you see these battles in many, many countries between development partners, when really the debate should be between government and citizens about what you want in terms of your system.
Yeah. And just to add to that, a really good example from Zanzibar, how that developed is that there is support for international NGOs that work on pushing these agendas. So in the case of Zanzibar, there's of course HelpAge that was very instrumental in fomenting that demand from citizens for the universal pensions, but also very clearly understanding their role that this had to come from government in the end. But you can also do that as a donor. You can also support civil society. And
okay, thank you. We move over to if there are any in the audience who have a brief question. Yes, Asbjørn?
Yeah, actually, I don't have a question, but I have some comments.
That's okay. That's fine too.
Thank you so much, Norad, for inviting us. It's really about time that this issue is starting getting debated. And thank you for excellent introductions and discussions. There are so many aspects of this which to be interesting to discuss further, not least the political side of it. But I will comment on two issues or perspectives. One is the human rights issue that Kalle mentioned. Many of these the traditional societies, particularly in Africa, people have rights, and the right to land was the most prominent and vital economic right they had. Now, the people are losing out on that. The population grows, and people are moving to cities, and there is less land. In some countries, we have seen some economic rights being established, replacing it in a way, like cheaper petrol in Nigeria, which benefited millions, or in Malawi, where I worked, subsidy for fertilizer and seeds, which were universal. Try to take those away from people, and I will revolt. And I think it is this, in this perspective, we also need to see universal benefits as a human rights issue, because in our human rights work, we have failed in the sense that we have not managed to combine the political and civil rights with the economic and social rights. Therefore, this democracy in these countries and human rights in these countries are now very vulnerable for the authoritarian tendencies. So we should go back here and strengthen economic benefits as a human rights issue. That was my one. Yeah, I have spent.
Okay, fine. Thank you, Oscar. There one more over here. What is if you can transport the microphone?
I don't think the microphone is on, but
It's
on.
on.
Okay, no, it's on.
Yeah. Okay. My name is Arne Dahle from the Norwegian Church Aid. Thank you very much for a very interesting introductions. Just one thing I've been thinking of is that how, and coming back to Tanzania and in other countries, how the political will that we see. I've been working with Brazil for many years, and now they have frozen the budget for 20 years on the social budget, education and health, and you have trends in other countries. How is it possible to get the political will for these issues, universal rights? I think that's the key question as I see it now.
Thank you. Yes, there's the last question is here, and then you will give some concluding remarks. Yes.
Hi, my name is Marianne. I work for Save the Children. You mentioned briefly that health.
You have to stand up.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Yes. You mentioned briefly that health aid played a role in the pension scheme in Zanzibar, and my question is about the role of international NGOs. As you know, Save the Children is globally promoting child-sensitive social protection. In some countries, very hands-on. We actually have child development grants aiming to get them slotted into the long-term social protection scheme. In others, it's about improving the procedures and processes of existing systems. But if the panel could say a bit about what role you think international NGOs could play in promoting this agenda, I would appreciate it.
Yes, thank you very much. We'll start with you, Trine.
Sure.
Yes.
On the role of NGOs, and I think that's a very apt question, especially in the context of Tanzania. I think there's a big role to play. And not only by international NGOs, of course, there's a place for those too, but at the local level, and even more specifically, if you look at the faith-based organizations at local levels, I think they can be very important as opinion bearers in terms of bringing this different understanding of transfers, right, of social safety nets why we need it and why it makes sense and why we support it and how it falls into the existing logic of solidarity and community support, right? So I think in particular at the local level you have that kind of role, and then also the role of watchdogs, if you put it that way, and that's both at the local level but also as the international NGOs can do a lot of work in monitoring how programs are implemented, how they function, what's happening at the local levels, etc. So I think a lot of that, and then of course at the international level there's continuous work around advocacy but also technical work that can be done, analytical work but also very concrete in the implementation of these programs.
Would you also like to comment on the human rights issue?
Sure. I mean, that's as you know in Tanzania now, that's also a very valid question, and I just simply agree. I think it has to be viewed also in a rights perspective. And there again, I think it's local perceptions and culture, and it's worth to have this dialogue really at the local level. If you ask, there's polls done, if you ask a Tanzanian, if tomorrow you fall into troubled times and you're not able to feed your children, who has the obligation to help you? And it is family, then there are friends, there's community, government is way down on that list. So there's also about creating that expectation also in a sense.
Colin, concluding remarks?
So I observed two questions more or less directly to me, the human rights issues, and I think these are very important aspects. I think it's just like human rights politically, they are supervised by, you have some commitment to them in the world. And that means that a neighboring country that doesn't follow it, they are criticized by other countries surrounding. We should have the same system for economic rights, entitlements to people. You can say that we have 10% goes to everybody shared in one way or another, a UBS, development bonus, it's introduced in Kenya, but Tanzania is a little bit slow. Of course, Tanzania will say that, look at Kenya, what they're doing. So that they're going to be forced to social organization in neighboring countries by pointing at examples that the others are given this right that everybody sort of had agreed to. And that they are much more concrete than these issues that are in the 17 things where you sort of, they are so abstract. 10% is something you can really measure and you can count on. And then to Arne. I agree that this is problematic, that sort of the governments are sort of buying the budget for a long time, and it's more prevalent in countries with high corruption than in others. I think this is problematic, but again, it is if you have other, if Argentina introduces it and Brazil doesn't, there are going to be some dynamics in Brazil as well, and you will have the basic problem in many countries is that the poor people are so poorly organized. They are so poorly organized. We had brute luck in this country that we organized all the unions from the bottom up. In Latin America, as you know, usually unions are middle-class institutions. They are for people with permanent jobs, and having a system like this, you have more of a social interest in it. So I rely more on these things, and I think that there's no such thing as a long-term commitment in the country for 30 years to the budget. So I think that's something that people say, but it doesn't. It doesn't stand up against political forces when they come to.
And the last word goes to you, Stephen.
Okay. I mean, I think on the human rights issue, I mean, I think it's critically important. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that every person has the right to social security, right? Particularly in issues of old age, unemployment, disability, etc., and social protection is particularly important for childhood. It's in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We knew that in 1948. That's why our country started putting in place these systems. We need to ensure that this is transmitted to other countries. And there are a range of countries, low middle income countries, that have the right to social security for everybody in their constitutions, such as Indonesia, Kenya, Bangladesh, etc. Tanzania, yeah. But these are for all citizens. Programs for the poor are not human rights based, they're anti-human rights in a sense. And we have to remember that programs for the poor are programs that benefit elites, not the poor. right? It's a difficult concept, but when you look at the concept of tax, who's paying for tax and transfers, we can't look at the transfers in the context of the outside the context of tax. Universal benefits have much higher levels of taxation. The rich are going to pay a much higher proportion of tax, therefore they're much more